the fall, and you know, it was a big step for us. And George told this story too, so I talked to George, and I tell George, we've got 14 new members, and by the way, 3 of them are women. And George always said that I said that he winked. I'm not so sure about that, but he did look the other way, because I mean, he was looking at the big picture. You know, I think he saw that as kind of a fad, and the important thing was that we took a nice pledge class, and we were on our way back to being a successful chapter. We took another 11 actually in the spring. Also, I think there were 3 girls in that class as well. But I will point out that in that fall pledge class, there was one special woman. It was the woman that I married and have been with for the last 39 years. So I'm gonna flash forward now to when I was president of the fraternity, and I went to my first NIC meeting. That was this is the international organization of fraternities from the United States and Canada. And at the time, they also had the meeting jointly with the AFA, which was the Fraternity Advisors Association. I didn't know anyone there except George and a couple of guys from the fraternity. And I went to this big banquet, you know, everyone's in tuxedos and all, and George grabs me, and it was like I was his son. I mean, it was amazing. He took me around, introduced me to people that I knew the name, Bill Schwartz, Howard Alter, and I just felt so good, you know, being shown around by George, and the respect that those people had for him was amazing. He received actually the highest award given by the NIC, and I'll never forget that, you know, being shown around by George, and the respect that everyone had for me because of George. It was a great experience. I'm really proud to have known him and spent a lot of time with him.
Thanks, Paul. Fortunately, this is the slot for past presidents, so you get to hear me again. I was the last president of Pi Lambda Phi to work with George when he retired from our fraternity, then holding the title of Executive Vice President. The last in a string of men George served since he began working for Pi Lam in 1966. 2 months ago, I was with his family and friends, neighbors, and our fraternity brothers as we said our goodbyes to George in Florida. But these things happen every day to many people. There are those special people who require special moments, moments of reflection, not just because of the fact they are gone from us, but moments to celebrate the fact that they have been with us and have impacted our lives. For me, George Beck impacted my life. I knew George for 43 years, as long as I had known my father, who died in 1996. 2 men from different backgrounds, who both happened to be in the Navy and in World War II. My father, a regular seaman, George, an officer. Both of them gave me guidance in life I needed to succeed. George was one of my mentors in Pi Lam, a fraternity brother and a friend. He guided me onto our governing board through the various positions until I became president. But that was not the whole story. We spent many, many hours talking about life and the future needs of Pi Lam. George knew where our fraternity needed to go, and the fact that he needed to move on to the next phase of his life. And the interesting thing about that is that a man that had such a full life up until the age of 70 moved on to meet such a wonderful woman and carry on such another great phase of his life. When I became president in 1988, I implemented many of George's ideas and began to plan for his retirement in 1991. George Beck, Stan Glasser, Richard Heim, and Jules Lunard are my 4 mentors who are now joined together in the chapter eternal, as they were so many times at the hospitality suite in our convention, telling the endless stories about Pi Lam and discussing the needs of our fraternity well into the night. I remember the last time I saw George and Barry in Florida. It was about a year ago. We tried to get together a few times for dinner during the winter season. Now, as you may recall, George was required to have his mandatory doers on the rocks before dinner. That was the story he told me many years ago as a prescription given to him by a doctor. I always questioned that particular medication. Now, at this point in his life, Barry, who seemingly outranked our captain, allowed him one drink, which we had before we left for the restaurant. At the restaurant, he ordered another, and Barry countermanded George's order, and George said, "Well, stands here," which of course was insufficient to change Barry's order. But as I recall, he was allowed a glass of wine, which he reluctantly accepted. After all, wine is not doers on the rocks. As we were saying our goodbyes, I gave George a hug and a kiss on the cheek. George gave me this odd look and a tilt of his head. And I said, "Come on, George, after all these years, you're like a father to me." George gave me that great smile. After all our years together, I remember that moment above all the rest. George and I were 30 years apart in age, but you would never know it. He knew me as a 19-year-old kid and as his boss. He cared deeply about his fraternity brothers, young and old, a tough Navy man who fought for his country, read many times the necrology at our annual convention, which is a listing of the brothers who had passed during the preceding year. And many times he broke up as he read the names of old friends who had died, and more than once the names of undergraduates who had passed, because he knew them and worked with them intimately. That was George. In closing, I will use a few words spoken by Pope Francis during a recent homily. The Pope said, "Throughout our existence, we see a mother's farewell who greets and embraces her son for the last time as he heads off to war. Every day, she wakes up fearing that someone will knock at her door and tell her, 'Thank you so much for the generosity of your son, who gave his life for the good of our country.' And there is also the final goodbye that we all say when the Lord calls us to the other side." Francis added, "The goodbyes, even the last one, are not the kind of goodbyes that mean see you soon, see you later, see you again. These imply that a person knows they are coming back, either straight away or a week later. The kind of goodbye the Pope was referring to means, I don't know when or how I will return. What do I leave by?" he continued. "I did this, and that. What have I done? It does me good to imagine myself in that moment. We don't know when there will come a time when that see you later, see you soon, see you tomorrow, or see you again will become the final farewell," the Pope said. This is our final farewell to George, who is gone from us, but is in our hearts forever. He left behind a great legacy of accomplishment, which has easily answered the Pope's question, "What do I leave behind, and what have I done?" Now it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium members of George's chapter at the University of Virginia, David Temple Jr., holder of the Big Pie, Steve Cole, holder of the Council Key, Mark Allen, and Everett Millett. Gentlemen.
We also have with us John Christiani, Omega Alpha. So it's an honor to join in this celebration of George, to be with you, Barry, and Tony, Diana, Tom, Teresa, and the rest of your friends and family, and to be with my brothers, my Pilan brothers. I knew George for over 45 years. I met him in February 1967. Our work together began when I was 20. I was in my second year at UVA. And it was a relationship that involved work. We had a shared purpose. I just want to tell you, briefly a little bit about myself and why George means so much to me. In the years before I met George, the few years before I met him, I lost two of my male heroes, my father to cancer and John Kennedy to an assassin. Like many of us at that time, watched on TV the trial of Nazi Adolf Eichmann and saw in the evidence the faces and bodies of some of the 2/3 of Europe's Jews who were exterminated. I learned at that point what happened to my European family. Then just a few months before I started classes at UVA was Bloody Sunday, the Selma marches in Alabama, which capped years of bloodshed against blacks. So this was the context in which I started classes at UVA. I quickly learned that fraternities ruled the political life and the social life of the school. But what I had no idea was that religious and racial prejudice ruled too. I played UVA soccer. I had good grades. So I was invited to join some of the most conservative fraternities at the UVA grounds. With the last name Cole, they had no idea I was Jewish. Now the Jewish fraternities knew I was Jewish. And I quickly found out about the religious and racial dynamics going on there. I wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted no part of the fraternity system, so I didn't join. About a year later, another undergraduate, Alan Silverman, asked me and a few others to change the fraternity system, to start one of our own, to challenge the exclusion, to form a group that was inclusive. So after initial communication with then Field Secretary Andy Gulbert, who's here with us today, a newly appointed executive director, George Beck, quickly arrived in Charlottesville. He helped us lay the groundwork. Like so many fraternities across the country during World War II, they folded. So UVA's Pi Lam chapter had folded in the mid-1940s. The Interfraternity Council, the administration, the dean did everything possible to keep us from happening. But this was home turf for George. He was Pi Lam. He had graduated there in 1943. He worked on the front lines with us, and he worked behind the scenes for us. It took great courage to stand up to a dean who vowed never to let an N-word, a black, graduate from being a member of a fraternity at UVA. Just incredible, unbelievable. This is the dean of the university. But George made it happen. And you're going to hear, it took close to 3 years, and you'll hear more in his own words, details how this came about later on. So by the way, 3 of those 69 refounders are here today. David Temple, Everett Millay, and me, and two youngsters, Mark Allen and John Christiani. So without George, Omega Alpha never would have been refounded. For my generation and the many generations thereafter, he helped to create a family of over 600 UVA brothers. He became a lifelong partner for me. We've worked together to make sure that the creed lives on at UVA. Changed my life. He armed me with the confidence and the know-how to fight for civil rights. And that fight became a large part of my personal and professional life. So I had found a new hero. I miss him. So let me now turn you over to another one of those teenagers who refounded the chapter. David Temple.
You know, George lives. His spirit is abundant and all around us. I have felt it from the beginning of my lifetime, adult lifetime at UVA, and I feel it today. And I know that he is sitting at a bar somewhere in heaven, a bar called Doer's Spot. with great pride. And so I will want to thank George Beck for his contributions to my lifetime, our lifetimes, to values that are shared by those across the globe, and for things that we fight for and have fought for and will continue to fight for, and where blood will be shed and where laughter will occur. And I want to thank you, George, for bringing Barry into our lives. She was a burst and is a burst of sunshine and great warmth and love. Thank you. And I want to thank you all while I'm here for the big pie that you bestowed upon me, because it follows from the values and the confidence that was initially instilled in part from my father and my mother and others and life in Richmond, but George Beck in particular, because that was who he was: courageous, meaningful, focused, loyal, loving, committed, and unerring in his values. Well, doers, but I mean, other than that. It helps just to say, just briefly, the context for the pre-UVA arrival and then what set up the UVA experience, and in part why we're here, why I'm here. When I arrived on grounds, also known as campuses elsewhere. This was 1965, and I had graduated from a strictly segregated high school, one of two designated for Richmond's African-American students. So we had the best and the brightest kids, the best and the brightest teachers, and some who needed to be brighter and some who needed to be best. But all were there. I was a class of 550 seniors. My rank was 6th. I was involved in everything. You look at our RABSA, which is our annual, and I'm in every picture, much to the resentment of many who still contend. But as a teen, I had also, in the 1960s, had involved myself in activities with the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, then known as SNCC. And their job was to help train localities of able and committed, youthful, black, then Negro Americans, particularly in the South, to take charge of their lives and communities and to adhere to the principles that were being espoused by Martin Luther King most precisely and most consistently, fervently, of nonviolence, of passive action, of determined action, and when those moments would occur, what to do to protect yourselves, but not to undermine the process. And so we learned civil disobedience tactics. We learned locking arms and falling safely together on the floor in the street where it might have to be. We learned when in targeted restaurants that where beer was thrown or spit, occasional urine, that you turn the other cheek. And if needed to be arrested, you were arrested. And I'm proud to say I was arrested and locked up. And so did my father. He told everybody about it. So after availing myself after all that, of coming to the University of Virginia, our flagship state university, Lyndon Johnson had helped that to happen. One that lawfully served only undergraduate males. It was a state university, undergraduate males, except for the nursing school. And of course, there would be no men in the nursing school, no. So here's what the context. But where I varied from Steve was invited. They wanted him there. They asked him to come to these conservative fraternities. He had the wonderful, loving judgment to say, no, you're not me. You're not my kind of persons. I'm not going to have any part of you. But for me, coming out of Richmond, having been arrested, having worked, I moved forthrightly into that bastion of fraternity life. And when they didn't come to see me, except for Theta Chi, who then turned red-faced and left when they saw who was there, I was determined that this would be my new cause. because there would be those who would have to follow us. And as it happened, I learned later that I was either the 11th, the 12th, or the 14th undergraduate blacks to graduate from the University of Virginia. That number still remains, of course. I'm not sure about that data, but that's what they tell me. So then came the Alan Silverman letter, George Beck, Andy, a wonderful cohort of young men, and bristling and recalcitrant refusals to allow us to go forward. And so, you know, we had Steve. The rest of us were 18, 19, and 20. Steve was 35 at the time. And so, with that kind of leadership and determination, and with George, we you know, there was not going to be our Dean Ronk who was going to prevent us from making this happen, or making me happen. But I felt obligated to give a choice to our fraternity, our club at that time. And I said to George and Steve, what if I stepped aside? You know, and then I could come back and pledge, and, you know, all would be happy. I didn't really want to do that. And I confess, and particularly in retrospect, that's not something I really wanted to do, and I hope I wasn't being insincere. But it made sense to give them that option. And to this day, both men, and Andy, I think you may have been a part of that. No, that's not going to happen. Ain't going to happen. And it was at that moment where I was embraced and made to be more, you know, accepted at that University of Virginia, and that we would locked arms together as we had in Richmond, and that we would fall together. There would be no spit and urine, I hope. Well, certainly not in bottles. There may be a party over here and there, and were, but not that. And so I thank God and George Beck for elevating those values and making that spirit, and my lifelong learning and spirit of wanting to achieve and to contribute and to give, continuing and meaningful. And so in ending, and I told you that George Beck was in this room, is in this room, and elsewhere. I remember one day George and Barry and I, it was a homecoming weekend, and I can't remember which homecoming weekend it was. We were on a shuttle going somewhere. And I said, as George was sort of had raised his arm quite that way, and he was wearing cuffs for some reason that day. Maybe we were going to something more, maybe semi-formal. And I saw these cufflinks that he was wearing, and they were absolutely stunning to me. I mean, I had never seen cufflinks like that before. They had like raised figures on them, and they were sort of surrounded by stainless steel. And Paul will tell you, you know, I'll just accidentally ask, you know, just playfully, you want that? And the next thing I knew, and I looked away and I was talking to somebody else, and George, I turned back to George, and there in his fist were these cufflinks. And he would not let me give them back. He, you know, and it got to the point where I was feeling, you know, look, these are wonderful, expensive, you know, you're going to keep those. And so I had to keep them. And I wear them today to honor his life and his spirit. Thank you so very, very much for those who contributed to this. And thank you for wanting to continue the life and values and contributions of George A. Beck. Thank you. And then, ta-da, Mark Allen. Mark Allen is a 2005 graduate of Omega Alpha chapter. One of the unique contributions made by Mark is that he served as Rex twice. And that was a mark of the leadership that our members bestowed upon him at that time, and their insistence that that kind of leadership continue. He continues now as vice chair of our I think, chair of our chapter advisory council and vice chair of our House Corporation Committee. And he has become a very dear friend over time, Mark Allen.
So Steve referred to me as a youngster, which I am far from it. However, apparently I do still make rookie mistakes to follow these guys. So thank you for the introduction, Dave. As you said, I'm Mark Allen from class of 05. Feel the theme of the day, I'm in a safe place where I can say that if there were ever a list of individuals made who embodied the spirit of our Pi Lambda Phi motto of not 4 years but a lifetime, that George Beck would most assuredly be at the top of that list. The interesting thing, though, as I've reflected over the last couple months since George's passing, is that the legend that is George, the legacy that he has left us with, is far beyond what I consider. I don't see George's legacy in a singular term, right? I don't see it as a singular term because to be singular is a matter of confining to the parameters of a single lifetime, according to that motto. And it's not fitting. And it's not fitting because of the sheer number of other lives, obviously in this room and beyond, that he's touched over the course of his life. And that's incredible. And I am privileged to be one of those individuals. Privileged to be an individual that he's not only directly and indirectly touched, there's many of those, but also it's powerful to see the number of individuals that he has yet to touch that may or may not ever know who George Beck was through that indirect touch. And that's the ripple effect that George will have on everyone's life. Whether he knew it or not, George was living to his own motto, and that wasn't not 4 years but a lifetime. It was rather not 4 years but a lifetime of lifetimes as he continues to live on in others. So how that affects me personally, I met George about 14 years ago, which is crazy, when I first joined Pi Lam. So I was kind of late to the George Beck game, but I got there. I'm happy I did. I really didn't get to know George all that well until the last 7 or 8 years through work through the Omega Alpha alumni community and the House Corps, both of which he was a very active part of up until the very end. And it was fun to get to know him. How he directly impacted me was, through those stories, through conversations over the course of the years, being an undergraduate brother who I was sure he had no idea who I was, but then having him call me, "Hey Mark, how are you?" when he'd come back for homecoming. So that happened all the time. Seeing those stories and seeing the big picture of Pi Lambda Phi and the creed play out very clearly through his eyes, when you know that in the past that was not necessarily as clear of a picture as it is today. And seeing that he was a part of that is really powerful. For that experience directly with George, I'm eternally grateful. Where I'm the most thankful, though, is the indirect impact that George had on my life. The impact that has made me a better person, and the person I am today, the man I am today. That comes from, as people have started to say, the people in this room that have come into my life that I would never have met. People like David and Steve, Christiani. I can say that with a surety that we would not be the friends that we are today if it were not for Pi Lambda Phi. For people walking through the doors of a fraternity house and deciding to join something because it meant something more. Who would have thought, right? So, again, that's where I'm truly grateful. That's the impact that I have, and I see that legacy living on again in the lives and the future of other people that, again, are not here, that may or may not ever know, again, who George was. That's fantastic. So with that, I'm going to cut things short. Thank you to the family, as people said, for sharing George. It's made a huge impact on everyone's life, and will continue to do so for many, many years. To George, thank you as well for everything that you've given to not myself, but on behalf of everybody else at 504 Rugby Road who walked through those doors at some point and decided again to join that fraternity. We appreciate everything that you did and the influence you had on others to help get us where we are today. We really appreciate that. So, Without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to another member at large for our House Corporation, Mr. Everett Millay, who I feel is fitting for the influence that has happened at 504 Rugby Road. We at the local chapter decided there needs to be a fitting memorial to George in that aspect, and I'll let Everett tell him a little bit more about that.
And my little brother.
Always. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to be fairly brief. I'm one of those who met George when I was 19 and had the company of these gentlemen here. I was part of Highlam as a colony when George Andy and others helped purchase